Hello, everyone. We want to welcome you to the 10th Annual 2021 Student Research Symposium. My name is David Cox, and I'm the Director of Skene Library, OSL, and the SRS. The SRS is an annual campus-wide event that provides both undergraduate and graduate students the opportunity to present their research in a variety of formats. Poster sessions, of which we've had 2 sessions already today, oral presentations, which we are going to hold this evening right now, and a 3-minute speech competition. We hope that you will join us for certainly the 3-minute speech competition and the other 2 poster sessions as they go on in the next few days. We want to thank you for joining us this evening for the oral presentations. And the SRS is grateful to Tech faculty member Dr. Sanchari Chowdhury and Tech employee Sarah Obanoff for their technical assistance this evening. I will be moderating tonight's event. Now, during normal times, as when there was no COVID-19, the SRS would take place in person on the beautiful New Mexico Tech campus. We'd be having a dinner and lots of space for people to enjoy the time with these 5 oral presentation presenters. Because of COVID-19, we're here in the virtual world, but we're still very thrilled that we're able to present these presentations for you. Tonight's event will feature 5 New Mexico Tech students who will present their research to you, and in turn, you will have the opportunity to ask questions. In a moment, I will start things off, but first, a brief word from an SRS staff member.
Hi everyone, I'm Sophie. We have a lot to cover, so this is how today's session will unfold. Each student will give a brief presentation based on their PowerPoint, and the moderator will facilitate questions from the audience. During the presentations, all of you will be muted, so there's no background noise or interruptions. When the time comes for the Q&A, you will be able to unmute yourself and ask questions. The chat box will remain open throughout the entire session. If you need technical assistance, please feel free to send a direct message to Sanchari. For ease of use and access, the moderators, volunteers, and presenters are at the top of the participant list. A couple of things. We hope upon hope there will be no technical difficulties or problems with internet access today. If we do experience a problem, please be patient as we work to solve it. If a power outage or a major event happens, we will contact you via email apart from the meeting. Here's a suggestion for the session itself. You might want to change your settings to speaker view, which makes the visuals and the presenters the main thing on your screen. From time to time, we'll be posting the link to both the oral presentations and the evaluation form in the chat box, so you can take a look at the presentations throughout the session. Finally, at the end of the session, we'll post it throughout the session, the evaluation link. Please fill it out as often as you are comfortable with. You will need to fill out a separate form for each poster and group. Thank you again for joining us. Let's begin. Dr. Cox?
Well, we get to begin very quickly here. You should expect that we're going to have about, let's say, an 8 to 10 minute presentation from the person presenting their PowerPoint. Then after that, we're going to have questions for a few minutes and allow for further bringing through the concepts of the research, and then we'll move on to the next person. So first up for us today is Joaquin Rabal, and he's a graduate student in the Mineral Engineering Department, and we're very pleased to listen to his analysis of copper mining accidents from 2010 to 2019, and some of the concepts he has created for us to study and understand. Joaquin, please proceed.
Great, thank you. I hope everybody can hear me all right. Thank you to the organizers for putting on today's event. And today, for my project, we'll be discussing an analysis that I performed on copper mining accidents in the United States from 2010 to 2019. And this was part of an Mineral Engineering 489 coursework, and you can see my team members on the slide as well. So first, we're going to talk about introduction to mine safety, pretty much cover why it's important. Then we're going to discuss the method, and where we developed a Python program which was able to perform some of the data analysis that we're looking for. Then I will be able to show you the results, which are basically the graphs of what we were able to come up with our Python in order to provide into the previous accidents which occurred during this time period. And then with the conclusions, we are going to be discussing maybe some measures which used by the mining industry in order to improve their safety. So the mining is important, but it is a very hazardous industry. However, there's been significant improvements which have taken place over the past 100 years. For example, there's been a 1,000-fold increase in coal mining industry over the last 100 years, excuse me. And it's not an industry that's going to go away. There's increased demand for raw materials, including copper, for electric vehicles, because electric vehicles and electric buses require significantly more copper than your average internal combustion vehicle. And so one thing that is done is there are mine safety training programs which are designed to reduce injuries and accidents and severity. So there already is those type of programs which do exist, but now this project is looking at the data which will inform some of these programs for safety training. So getting to the method and data analysis for this project, we downloaded a data from MSHA, which is the Mine Safety Health Administration. It's a Department of Labor organization, and they keep track of all the yearly accidents that occur in the mining industry, and that's including stone, coal, copper, gold, different commodities. We developed a Python program which would filter, analyze, and visualize this data, and then we looked at different trends in order to make recommendations to the mining industry in order to improve safety programs. So a couple of the hypotheses and questions that we were looking at answering is, what are the most common accidents and injuries, and how can we improve safety programs in the future? So before we get into the graphs, this is essentially what we were given to what this is one example of the MSHA data, and you can just see a few of the columns. In fact, there's over 60 columns for each data point, and then there's approximately 10,000 injuries that do occur across the mining industry every year. So it's quite a large file, and as you can see, there's codes as well for the mining machinery, for example, and different mine locations. So that's what we were up against, is looking at this data and turning it into meaningful analysis for the mining industry. Now, for this project, we focused entirely on the copper mining from 2010 to 2019. Now, this first graph just gives a pretty general overview of the number of accidents that there is in the mining industry, which is the red line. And you can see that there's approximately 10,000 to 11,000 in 2010 to 2011, and then it gradually went down. To 2019, we saw a decrease where it's about 7,000. However, in the copper mining, we do see that there is a variability and there's much less accidents. You can see along the right-hand side with the blue, there is between 300 to 420 accidents, but you can see that from 2017 to 2019, there was actually an increase in the copper mining accidents. So that's something that we are gonna kind of pay attention to. Now here's the next graph. It's in the same format, but it's comparing two different ideas, and this one is the number of fatalities, which is in red, and the yearly fatalities go from 2 to 0 per year in the copper mining industry. And then also in the blue is the total days missed due to these injuries, and that shows that there's 7,500 days missed by copper mining workers per year. That's the consequence of mine safety not being 100%, is that there is some days lost. So that is something that we want to work again, make sure that people are able to work in a safe environment and bring that down. This next graph that we have shows the total injuries, the type of injuries, and we can see that there's a majority of all the injuries occurred just a few types of injuries. So for example, the blue one struck is the highest numbers of injuries, and that one you can see it's about a third, so almost a third, and this is for the entire 10-year time period. So you can see that of all the injuries that occurred during this time period, struck was approximately 1/3 of all of the injuries that or accidents that did occur, and then followed by overexertion. So just struck and overexertion by itself, those two accidents alone account for more than 50% of all the accidents that occurred during this 10-year period. So you can tell that these are very important, and they do occur a lot. And then also fall and caught. So those 5 accidents, injury types account for, as you can see, I believe it's 83% of the entire all accidents that occurred during this time period. So that just shows the priorities where the education, this could be used to inform the education and safety programs to show that, even though there is all these different injury types, for example, inhalation, ingestion, electrocution, contact, that the biggest problems are just basically struck, and usually that's struck by a vehicle, and then overexertion is second. So it's making sure that people are performing the job with the appropriate resources that are available. Now this next graph shows the top 10 yearly injured body parts in the copper industry, and I'm not sure if you all can see that, probably, but the most injured body part which occurred was the hand. It's a little bit, maybe counterintuitive at first, but then when you do think about it, it makes sense that hand would be the most commonly injured because you're using your hand so many, while you're working, and then you're going to be putting it in hazardous areas or possibly areas that you wouldn't be able to see, and then hand, followed by the back, the arm, eyes. So this just shows the different priorities that we can go after in order, not just PPE, but also education and training for the mining industry in order to reduce some of these injuries. And the data, there's a lot of data that is being shown here, but I think a couple of things really pop out, and that is that the 2019, which is the teal, I know it's hard to see, the turquoise, but when you look at back injuries, in 2019, there was a huge jump in the back injuries, and so that's very concerning and something that should be looked at, and that's something that is shown directly through this data. And then I think it's also interesting that the back injury is the second most common, and overexertion was the second most common type of injury. So I think that those two could possibly be related. I've been looking at a possible way of correlating those two, similar type graph. Now here's a histogram. I did a little differently, a little bit of a different style for this one, just because everything was overlapping each other so much. But basically what this is shows for each mine worker that was injured, their years of mining experience along the x-axis, and then this is a histogram, so there's a number of accidents. So what this graph demonstrates is that throughout all the different years, whether it's 2010, 2019, 2011, that the most number of accidents, the highest number of accidents occurs to brand new miners with 0 to 5 years experience. And, you know, I think that that makes intuitive sense because they are just starting out. So they're just learning not only the job, but also how safety works and how not to get injured on the job. So I thought that this was something very interesting, showing that it was mostly younger miners that got injured. And that does have to do with the workforce as well. And then I have another histogram here, which shows on this time on the x-axis, it is days lost per accident. So if days lost per accident is for each accident, they have a certain number of days lost, and they basically it shows the injury severity. And what this graph shows is that this again, another histogram, is that most accidents had 0 days lost for that accident. So although there may have been quite a large number of accidents, most of them resulted in 0 days lost. So perhaps they weren't very big, strong or severe accidents. This one is a skyplot showing the years of mining experience and days lost per accident. And basically this just shows that on the bottom is the years of mine experience. So as the gain mine experience, number of injuries goes down and the severity also goes down for the days lost per accident. And this final graph shows the average days lost for mine versus mine work experience. And this one is actually grouped by experience level. And what this graph shows is that the least experienced miners, which are the orange bars, which is the orange bar, has less average days lost per injury than the yellow bar, which is the more experienced miners. So this shows that even though the less experienced miners have more accidents, they're less severe than when the more experienced miners have accidents. Then there's more days lost in that. So these are just some of the data analysis that we were able to perform on, and we're going to be working on different categories as well. This was based upon a federally funded MSHA database of accident injuries. It was focused on 2010 to 2019 in the copper mining industry. And as I mentioned, it was noted that most accidents occurred to new miners, but the severe accidents occurred to more experienced miners. We did make the Python code available on GitHub, so if you would like to download the data and possibly make your own graphs, whatever you'd like, that is available, and I put the link there. Okay, and these are my citations. I'd like to open it up for questions. I noticed that there was a question in the chat.
It's going to direct your attention to that, Joaquin. It's from Stuart Thompson.
I can ask it. Yeah, so it's just how much of a reduction in accidents overall for the mining industry is the reduction in number of overall miners. So the coal mines are closing like crazy, right? At least in the developed world.
Yeah, and that is something that we're going to look at making this more of a rate. For example, the tonnage produced this many injuries, and yeah, it does have to do a lot with there is a significant reduction in, for example, coal mining jobs. However, most of the accidents that do occur in the mining industry, of the 10,000 that did occur, were due to the stone and quarry and aggregate.
Yeah, okay.
And that makes about half the mining industry, and that's going to be there for a while. So, definitely this is something that coal has its own challenges and can be dangerous in a higher rate. And actually copper is one of the safest mining that there is types of mining, but you can still see that there is still room for improvement and areas that can be worked on. So thank you for your question.
Cool. I have
There
another
are
one too.
questions?
I can wait.
Okay. Are there other questions from anyone? I know Stuart's got another.
I'll ask it then. So for the older miners taking longer time off with accidents, you know, the assumption there was that they had worse injuries, but it might just be that younger miners feel pressure to go into work or get fired, whereas older miners maybe are more secure in their position and maybe frankly like, well, this employer owes me and I am injured, so I'm going to actually take the time it takes to recover.
Yeah, that is definitely, there is a lot of behavioral issues, and I would even say possibly non-reporting of injuries, especially if there's been 0 days work, you know, taken off. And so I think that can be an issue, but you know, we were just looking at what was inside the MSHA database, just as best as we can. But yeah, there's definitely going to be a lot of, and plus, you know, with the older miners, you also have a more old school mentality, and that can work like, oh, not reporting the lesser injuries, but then also, you know, maybe trying to suffer through the injuries, or it could go the other way that you were saying. So there's definitely, you know, and this is an aggregate of thousands of people and injuries across the United States. So this is looking at this from a very, you know, general analysis, top down, but there definitely is some very considerations such as that one to look at, you know, when analyzing these numbers. So
I'm descended from a dead miner, so, you know.
Yeah. I thought I remembered that, Dr. Thompson. So,
yeah.
Anne-Marie Pearson, Dr. Anne-Marie Pearson has a question in chat. Anne-Marie, do you want to read that?
Sure. So it was a fascinating presentation, and one of the things that struck me, if you'll pardon the pun, was that I was really interested in the way that you were defining the types of injuries that you were analyzing. And so you said the terms were struck and overexertion being the major injuries. But I was wondering, do you have data on what people were struck by? Because I think you mentioned vehicles, but I was assuming in mines it would be falling objects or things like that. Do you have that data? And what did it look like? And then things like overexertion. Was there more specifics with that, or was the data pretty limited?
Right, and that's a really good question, and you know, something that all the researchers that are dealing with this data set is working on, because actually there are a lot. There's a column. There's 60 columns for every accident that happens, and you know, that ranges from time of day to like location to, and that even does include notes that they may want to write about the accident. So in this research, I wasn't doing it, but I've seen other researchers are doing, for example, natural language processing on the notes. So that way they can differentiate between struck by, whether it's a roof fall, whether it's an accident. And one of the articles that I had read said that possibly one of the reasons that struck may be one of the highest is because it's a colloquial term that people use and say, oh, my eyes were struck by this sight. So there's definitely a lot of challenges involved in categorizing it. And the different categories that the person uses to when they fill out the form and how that gets reported to, and those things can have an effect, and it's about drilling down to the data, which I wasn't able to quite yet, but with the natural language processing and a lot of what the researchers are doing, they're really working on differentiating that into different groups and causes, and you know, whether it's a rock fall or a car or whatever it is. So
great, thank you so much.
Is there another question from anyone? It looks like William has a question. William, do you wish to ask that?
Yes. Yeah, I want to know how if you incorporated any information from training, safety training that is being given in various companies to how that reduce injuries.
No, we didn't look at specific companies, and then also this was copper focused across the United States. However, that is mostly, if you look at the geographic location, a lot of it is the #1 state is Arizona, and then followed by New Mexico. And if we're talking copper mining and Arizona, New Mexico, definitely talking about free ports, but we haven't, specifically looked at what they've been doing, other than just the general, safety programs. And that'll probably be the next step, is looking at what the safety programs are and whether they, match upon what we see here. For example, stroke and overexertion being the top 2 injuries. How much of the safety program is geared towards those 2 injuries, and how much it matches based upon the data, or if they're teaching, the hazards that don't occur very much. For example, we can see the flash burns. There were 17 of them across the entire industry, across the entire nation for 10 years. So that's definitely something that we're gonna start to look at a little bit more, as incorporating some of the safety programs that do exist and how they can be modified based upon the data that we're looking at here. So thank you for that.
All right, thank you, Joaquin. We appreciate you taking questions and presenting to us. And that provides us a real snapshot type of picture, just like you were trying to do, of issues that people face and have been faced with injury in the copper mining industry. So thank you.
Thank you.
Let's move on to our next presentation. And remember, you can use the chat box if you wish to maybe send a question to Joaquin about this that he might be able to answer on the side in chat or whatever. And that'll happen for, many of the presenters. So what we have now is Charlotte Duggan, who is in environmental engineering. And she has a presentation with regard to air quality and climate, and certainly aerosols. So Charlotte, please begin.
See how I can move back here. Oh no. Okay, here we go. Hi everybody. My name is Charlotte Duggan, and I am here as a master's student in environmental engineering. My advisor is Dr. Kip Carrico. And today I'm going to be presenting with you a comparison of 2 filter-based absorption instruments and their relation to air quality and climate change. Okay, so starting with a little bit of background, an aerosol is a liquid or a solid particle in the air, and we can quantify or categorize aerosols in a couple different ways, but one of the common ways is by diameter. So you can see to the left here, a PM 2.5 and a PM 10 particle in comparison to a human hair and sand. And these aerosols can get into the air a couple different ways, but mostly from transportation, agriculture, wildfires, and industry. And they are usually the result of incomplete combustion. So why are we studying aerosols? The simple answer is climate change. And a particle will have either an absorbing or a scattering effect on light, and it will cool or warm the planet. And we can quantify this with the absorption coefficient, or BABS, and it's based off a particle's refractive index. A darker particle will absorb light and cause a warming effect, while a lighter particle will scatter it and have a cooling effect. So in my research, I'm going to be studying carbonaceous aerosols in particular and their relation to climate change. Here are the 2 instruments that I've been using. The first is the tricolor absorption photometer, or the TAP, and the other is the mini ethylometer, MA200. and they're both filter-based instruments, which we'll discuss more later. And the minimum detection limit is graphed to the right, and you can see that both instruments, for their cost and their size, are quite accurate and pretty good quality instruments. Here's a comparison of them, and we can see that they both have a wide range of wavelengths that they can test. They're both lightweight and they're both small. And because of this, they can be used on many platforms and can be used for many different types of tests because of their portability and ease of use. So now I'm going to get into some of our findings. Here are some of the temporal trends from earlier this year, and we can see these clear spikes in the absorption coefficient. And we believe that these are from indoor wood burning when it was colder here, because this has stopped in warmer months. And it's very interesting because they all are happening between 8 p.m. and midnight. And what was really cool about this is that this was some of our earliest data. And you can see that both instruments are having spikes at similar times, which was quite exciting for us pretty early on in our data exploration. So the next thing we wanted to do was correlate the two instruments to one another to make sure that they're both seeing the same events and accurate to one another. So this is some data from mid-February, and the x-axis is showing the absorption coefficient for the TAP instrument, and the y-axis is for the MA200 instrument. And we can see that the data for the ethylometer is about 20 to 70% higher than for the TAP. And for this data set, this is one of our lower correlation days, so a little closer to that 70% mark. And this is somewhat expected. In literature, the ethylometer is known to have to kind of overestimate the absorption coefficient. And we have been looking into this, and we're still looking into it now. And we've done some early testing on relative humidity, and we have seen some relation between a higher correlation with lower humidity and vice versa. But all that being said, they do have quite a high correlation, which you can see with the R-squared values. They're all above 0.9. And we have larger discrepancies at shorter wavelengths. And with the independent student t-test, red and green wavelengths were statistically significantly similar, 5 out of 6 days, and the UV was 2 out of 6 days. So I said before that filter-based instruments can have some biases naturally. So looking over here to the right, this is almost like the inside of a filter-based instrument, where the light bulb is the light source from the instrument. This is the filter itself with particles deposited on it. And then this eyeball is the detector. So a couple things can happen in a test. We can get some of the light that will scatter from the filter itself. The light can be absorbed by a particle that was already on the filter, or the light can pass through the filter and be detected. So these are what causes some of the discrepancies and biases in the instrument. And there's another type of instrument in the aerosol world called an in situ instrument. And these are known to avoid some of these biases. And we're going to talk about them on the next slide. So some future work for us. Our first goal is to measure fresh and aged smoke. So we have an ongoing collaboration with the Los Alamos National Laboratory, and they have 2 of these in situ instruments. They have the PASS-3 and the CAPS instrument in their lab, and we want to compare our filter-based instruments to these in situ instruments to make them more reliable, and because it's we avoid those biases that we have with our instruments. And we also want to use this PAM reactor pictured to the right. And this instrument can simulate aerosol aging in a matter of minutes, but for day-long testing. So in other words, it can almost simulate how an aerosol would age over days in just a couple of minutes. And that's some really interesting data we can get there. And next, after we make our instruments validated, we will attach our instruments to a drone, and we can get some really interesting plume measurements. In conclusion, I've been conducting absorption instrument measurements with 2 different filter-based instruments. And in the future, we're wanting to advance our instrumentation and expand our research. Thank you for listening. Do you guys have any questions for me?
We're open for questions. Go ahead.
Hi, Charlotte. Very nice presentation. I just have one question. Why do you think you see spike in the signal in the midnight, like 8 p.m. to midnight? Is there any reason for that?
We're thinking it's because those hours of that time of the year, it got very, very cold, and people in Socorro like to use wood fires indoors, and that smoke will go into the air from your house and will cause a higher concentration of carbon aerosols. And those measurements were all taken in Jones Annex on campus. So that was another interesting finding. Yeah.
So, oh yeah, that was my another question. Like, are you setting it up outside, inside the lab? Where are you setting it up?
It's inside a lab, but there is piping to the outside. And we have a 2.5 micron cyclone cutoff. So that means that only particles under 2.5 microns can come into the cyclone.
Thank you.
So it's located inside, but we're taking outside measurements.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Other questions for Charlotte? Anne-Marie, I see you got your mic off.
Yes.
On, I mean.
So, yep. So the question that I have is, how do the in situ instruments avoid the biases that you described that your instruments have?
So to start off, they don't have the filter, which causes a lot of that scattering and the shadowing that we see. And the in situ instruments in general, they use laser technology, measure change in pressures, things like that. So they still have the same idea of you have something coming in and we're detecting it over here. So it's a similar concept, but because we don't have that filter, we can avoid some biases.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Other questions for Charlotte? My question is, as you're expanding your research and instrumentation, I'm wondering about what you think you may find. Do you have some hunches from all of this beginning research?
Maybe I'm being hopeful, but I feel like our instruments will be accurate. I have a pretty, I know the ethylometer might not be quite as correlated, but yeah, currently we're doing a 1 hour time average, which is pretty standard. And yeah, I'm really interested to also explore different types of data management and see how we can best describe the data and things like that.
You do have a question in chat from Dr. Gilberto Gonzalez Parra. He's wondering if there are confounding variables. That's the question. So,
can you expand on that? I don't understand your question.
Gilberto, can you ask that question?
Hello, how are you?
Doing
Good,
well.
how are you?
sorry, this could be a tough question. So don't worry if you don't answer, you know, because I found this problem in some of my research and other research. And this is very typical when you do statistical studies. There are some variables like bias that could affect the results. Every time that you do regression, right, there are some variables that are, we call those confounding variables, and they can, you know, affect your results. So my question is, could it be possible that you have some variables that you didn't take into account in your study, in your regression study?
I kind of mentioned one of them. The one that just kind of comes to the top of my head is the humidity, the relative humidity. That's something we just very recently started to kind of look at, and I did a similar test with the, basically what we decided was, in general, humidity is higher at night. So we divided our times into day and night, and we did see that there was higher correlation during the day. And that's something those original data that I showed did not take into account. Maybe also looking at different averaging times. So maybe I could have done a 15-minute average and then done a statistical t-test on that. But those are the top two that come to mind.
Thinking about in library work where we have a temperature humidity chart that we use all the time to try to make sure that there's a balance in the midst of things, because humidity is very fluctuating. So I think you tried to make a good result out of doing what you did. You know, you acted positively. So thank you. Any other question for Charlotte? We're going to give her one more chance if anybody's got one. All righty then. I seem to be able to remember that I'm supposed to remind you all that there are evaluations that you can pick up. I know Katie put some up for when Joaquin was presenting. We also have oral presentation links, but then also the evaluation link there. So please, Charlotte will love having your evaluations. Trust me.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay. And we appreciate the time and the energy you put into this. Thank you. Let's move on to our next presentation. And this is a presentation that Ki Wang, who also goes by Casey, is going to be presenting to us, and has quite a collection of information via chemistry in her graduate program. So Casey, please begin.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Qi Wang. You can call me Casey. I'm a graduate student in the chemistry department. It's my pleasure to present part of our work, which may reveal the relationship between breast tumor membrane lipids and radiation therapy outcomes. Firstly, a significant property of tumor. Cancerous tissues often experience low oxygen conditions, namely hypoxia. Oxygen enters cells by diffusion across the phospholipid bilayer membranes. Compared with the normal vasculature, the one in tumor is disrupted, in which oxygen cannot be spread evenly. The regions which are far away from the blood vessels experience limited oxygen supply, forming the regions of hypoxia. The proliferation of tumor can be promoted by hypoxia. Hypoxic tumor cells are resistant to radiation and chemotherapy. So more thing about the radiation therapy, it is proved that in the presence of oxygen, the effectiveness of radiation therapy can be enhanced 3 times. In order to kill the cancer cells, intracellular oxygen is turned into reactive oxygen species, which can cause DNA damage, even cell death. In one word, oxygen transient through the membrane is significant for cancer research, since it can change the hypoxia condition and then increase the radiation therapy effectiveness. Then a brief introduction of membrane lipids. Lipids are like tadpoles, but with the 2 tails. called SN1 and SN2. In principle, SN1 tail is saturated and SN2 tail is unsaturated. So they are showed with straight and bended lines. This lipid is one of the most common lipid in our normal cell membrane. The tails in it are about the same length. Generally, we obtain most of our membrane lipids from food instead of synthesizing them. Hilvo group has found that the contents of some de novo or new synthesized lipids are abnormally high comparing with the normal breast cells. The amount of the de novo lipids also increases with the stages of the breast cancer. Therefore, we picked some of this de novo or new synthesized lipid tails and combined with the same head group. Since the tails of the most common lipid in our membrane is about the same length, these de novo lipids have chain mismatch. Here shows one of our systems which is generated by physics-based modeling technique. To form the bilayer membrane, these tadpoles would arrange parallelly head to head, tail to tail. Each system only contains one type of lipid. The membranes are in 2 layers of the water to mimic the cell environment. Our group is interested in understanding how the membrane composition, which is the lipid composition, affects oxygen permeability. Permeability is the ability of the membrane to let oxygen go through the lipid bilayer by diffusion. You can consider it as the speed of the oxygen transfer through the membrane. Except for the oxygen permeability, many properties of the bilayers can also be obtained from these models. We have hypothesized that this de novo or new synthesized lipids have something to do with the hypoxia in breast cancer. In other words, we will need to compare the oxygen permeability of the de novo lipid membrane with the one of the common lipid membrane. If the de novo lipid membrane show lower oxygen permeability, it might be related to hypoxia in breast cancer, which would provide a new perspective for cancer treatment. Here is a short movie of our simulation. So during the simulation, all of the molecules are moving, including the oxygen, which is showed as red spheres. It is obvious that most of the oxygen molecules are in the middle of the bilayer, even though we put them into the water layer at the starting place. This plot shows the relationship between the chain mismatch and the oxygen permeability. The lipids are labeled with the number of the carbons and the carbon-carbon double bond for the tail. For example, the 16-0-18-1 means SN1 tail has 16 carbons and 0 double bond, and SN2 tail has 18 carbon and 1 double bond. Like I mentioned before, unsaturated tail is usually SN2 tail. From the data, chain mismatch does affect the oxygen permeability. Compared with the most common lipid, the longer SN1 tail lipids show lower permeability, and the shorter SN1 tail showed higher permeability. In particular, long saturated and short unsaturated phospholipid tails show decreased oxygen permeability. Therefore, this new synthesized lipid or de novo lipids might contribute to the tumor cells' hypoxia if their effects on oxygen permeability are preserved in the real biological membranes. The insights gained from this work may lead to new strategies for personalized radiation therapy treatment. We also have investigated the cavities in the bilayers. Cavity means the free spaces which oxygen molecules can occupy. The images show the cavities inside of the bilayer as the red mesh, And the plots above show the differences of the cavity volume between these two systems. So you can see the right system has more cavity than the left one. However, this result, this cavity result is not consistent with our previous findings, which are the oxygen permeabilities. So we assume that the oxygen molecules are trapped and travel laterally in the center of the bilayer instead of transiting through the membrane. So we will continue our work on figuring out what happens after oxygen moving into the bilayer by tracking the oxygen trajectories. Meanwhile, we will try to build more complex bilayers by adding more phospholipids, cholesterol, and proteins. All of them are common in our membrane. And as we all know, the composition of the natural bilayer membrane is really complex. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge my supervisor, Dr. Sally Pius, our group member, Rachel Dawson, and I'd also like to thank the funding agency, Glenda Foundation, and Clean PR. Thanks Student Research Symposium for providing this opportunity, and thank you all for listening. I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Please, that sounds like a good thing. Very interesting conversation. And Maria has her hand up. I see. I saw that one at least first anyway. That's a hand up, right, Anne-Marie?
It was a clap.
Well, that's even better. Okay, so.
Thank you.
Okay, did you have a question or you just wanted to clap? So.
I just wanted to clap. If I have a question, I would definitely will.
Okay, wonderful. Are there any questions anyone would like?
I have a question. So thank you. It was a very nice presentation. I just have one question. How do you consider the effect of void on your permeability? Because I see there are a lot of voids or pores in your membrane. So are you keeping that constant from one composition to another, or how do you consider that?
So, sorry, let me move. So you mean the voids in the bilayer, is that correct? Mm-hmm. So basically, now we are moving to investigate the voids because even though cavity can show the space which oxygen can go to, but voids gonna be like more specific. And we can see from our data, like the cavity data is not consistent with our oxygen permeability. So we would move to the void investigations later, but so far, like we are not controlling the voids. So basically we're letting everything is moving during the simulation, and then we will just kind of detect what happened during that simulation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
You have a question in the chat that talks about, can you mention briefly what type of model PyMol uses? Discrete structures, are there discrete structures, I think is the add-on to that.
So basically the package we are using is called Ember, and we are generating this, the image you are seeing in PyMol. So we're not doing the simulation in PyMol. Is that answer your question?
Do you have a follow-up on that, Gilberto?
Yes, thank you for your answer. It's because I was reading the abstract and it says PyMol over there at some place, but it's okay, I understood. So is discrete or continuous, please? Thank you for your talk. Very nice.
Thank you.
Other questions from anyone?
I've got one. I just wondered if there was any plans to test in actual tumor tissue, like so like the center of a tumor might be anoxic or low oxygen, but the outside of a tumor quite often has fairly normal oxygen access.
It will be great if we can find a collaborator which can who can do this kind of thing, but I have to admit that the research about this de novo or new synthesized lipids very limited. And there's like, I haven't seen any experimental data for this new synthesized lipids. So I will be like excited if we can find a collaborator.
We certainly have tumor cells. Dr. Rogel does and I do. And then I can give you whole tumors at some point if you want them, but they're from mouse. But yeah, we can chat about that.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, just get you or Sally to email me.
Yes, thank you very much.
Any other questions? Casey's ready to go here. All right, Casey, what we're going to do is we're going to remind everybody that there's evaluations and things like that. Don't get nervous about that. We're just trying to make sure you get some good feedback. And we are pleased with what your presentation was, and certainly you got some claps, so that was pretty nice. And I hope for future collaboration with all the programming that and research that's done on campus with regard to cancer. So thank you for your time. And please stay close by, okay? And we might have questions for you in chat, and we might even have a little bit of an open question time a little bit at the end of all this. So thank you. Our next presenter is Brittany Green, and she's an undergraduate in civil engineering. And she's going to talk to us about decarbonization or decarbonizing New Mexico transportation and look at best practices. So Brittany, please present to us, and please start.
Okay, hello everybody. My name is Brittany Green, and I'm going to be presenting the best practices for decarbonizing New Mexico's transportation. So first, I'm going to be giving a little bit of context as to how this project started. In January of 2019, New Mexico joined the U.S. Climate Alliance. This allowed Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham to start the New Mexico Interagency Climate Change Task Force. Under this task force, there are various climate action teams. The ones listed on your screen are transportation related. Therefore, the New Mexico Department of Transportation is used to supplement these. The New Mexico Department of Transportation then employed the New Mexico Tech Research Team to conduct this project. So our project's goals are to find the best ways to decarbonize the transportation sector. In order to do this, we have our project broken down into a few tasks. First, we analyzed other states' actions towards decarbonization efforts. We synthesized this information with a literature review. At the same time, we started developing a computable general equilibrium model. Any gaps in knowledge from the literature review was supplemented with a survey. Finally, we take all of this information to develop recommendations for stakeholder collaborations. For this presentation, I'm going to be discussing gas tax alternatives and phasing out flex fuel programs and incentives. So first, we're going to talk about the gas tax. The gas tax is the main funding method for the maintenance, development, and operation of public roads. It is implemented on the state and federal level every single time a motorist fuels their vehicle. On your screen, you actually have a figure with various gas tax rates in specific states. And on the left, we have other notable rates. Despite this, we have many problems with the gas tax. And this actually comes from vehicles themselves. Fuel economy in vehicles is continuously improving, and therefore this means that motorists are actually purchasing less fuel than ever, while putting more damage onto roads than ever. This can be seen with the figures on your screen. On the left, we have the New Mexico gas tax rate. And as we can see, as time continues, our rates are slowly decreasing. Meanwhile, the United States vehicle miles traveled rates are continuously increasing. Therefore, the problem with the gas tax is that it is not earning enough revenue to maintain road quality. Therefore, we need to look towards alternatives. Any alternatives that we look towards is going to try to supplement the high damage to roads with higher revenue. This can be done with many, many methods, but one of the most attractive ways that engineers are looking towards is actually charging motorists based on how many miles they're traveling rather than how much fuel they're consuming. This would be conducted with a vehicle miles traveled programs. There are many ways to implement VMT programs, and we're going to be discussing 3. The first is odometer readings. Odometer readings would consist of the motorist reporting their odometer reading at the beginning and ends of the month. The difference in miles will then be calculated and sent to a charging agency. The charging agency will then multiply the miles by a flat per mile rate. So again, the goal here is to try to charge a motorist based on how many miles they're traveling and not how many gallons of gas they're consuming. The next method is onboard devices. Onboard devices take this exact same concept, except it would be the vehicle actually communicating with the charging agency. This would be done by installing a device into the OBD2 port of the vehicle. And then it would just basically count and have that line of communication directly with the charging entity. The final method is radio frequency identification, or RFID readers. This consists of a tag and reader system. Readers are placed along the roads, and as they are able to detect a vehicle with a tag on it, they're going to start counting the miles. Then motorists are charged typical to the other methods discussed. So which method is actually the best is kind of unknown. On paper, the pros and cons for every single method can be outlined very easily, but it is still difficult to understand which is going to be best for both states and motorists. So this is where our survey is going to come in. Hopefully, we're going to get feedback from other Western states and see which works best for all parties involved. Then we can be able to implement that method in New Mexico. Now we're going to be switching up gears a little bit and talking about flex fuel vehicles. Flex fuel vehicles are vehicles that run on a mixture of gasoline and ethanol. And ethanol is actually our key ingredient here. Ethanol is a renewable fuel that runs on, or is made from, corn and plant materials. The fact that it's an alternative fuel or a renewable fuel makes it an alternative fuel vehicle. Alternative fuel vehicles are any vehicles that run on non-traditional petroleum fuel. To kind of give an idea of what that actually means, this would actually be hybrid vehicles or electric vehicles. So in talking about phasing out flex fuel programs and incentives, we need to actually understand what these programs are. This program comes from the Energy Policy Act. This was passed in 1992 with the goal of lowering emissions from vehicles. However, in 2005, there actually became an amendment for motorists. These incentives basically gave purchasers the option that said, if you purchase alternative fuel vehicles, we'll give you credits to purchase even more. And this resulted in flex fuel vehicles being acquired the most under the Energy Policy Act. In fact, in 2018, 93% of vehicles acquired under the Energy Policy Act were flex fuel vehicles. Therefore, the reason why we want to start phasing out these incentives are because flex fuel vehicles still run on gasoline. These incentives can be put towards electric vehicles or something that isn't going to emit as much carbon while still being not fully implemented in the way that flex fuel vehicles are. So finally, next steps for our project. Right now, we are currently conducting our survey where we're contacting other Western states, seeing how they handle these decarbonization efforts. And then the information we gathered from the literature review, the survey, and the model are going to help us develop recommendations for the New Mexico Department of Transportation. These recommendations are therefore going to help New Mexico as a whole decarbonize our state. And that is it. Any questions?
Well, Brittany, thank you so much for that. That's very interesting stuff. I have some thoughts that I'll maybe extend to you after a bit, but first I'd like to see if there's any questions from our viewing group and see what they might have to ask you. Any questions from anyone?
I can go again.
Oh, why don't you?
How do you think Americans would react to having their vehicles tracked, and how would that work across state borders?
Across state borders, that specifically requires a ton of collaboration. And one of the professors actually working on this project is Dr. Frank Reinow, and he's going to help us actually develop these collaborations. And that's one of the biggest parts, is actually getting the public outreach is one of the biggest parts. Because we have to be able to educate our public and tell them, like, hey, this information isn't going to be used for anything other than strictly counting miles traveled. So I would say off the bat, it probably wouldn't have the best perception unless we were strictly talking odometer readings.
Yeah.
My question to follow on that was Stuart. The real question, I think, is the reaction of people who think that their car is an extension of themselves, and therefore they don't like somebody able to check their odometer.
Yeah.
And maybe Dr. Thompson, is that kind of some of the direction you have with libertarianism and things like that, people thinking the government would encroach or whatever? The other thing is trying to make sure, if I travel from here to Washington State, is it possible for me to have whatever charges I am going to be levied given to the states I drove through? And that, I think, is a real issue.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the biggest issues that we're seeing with these types of programs. I definitely agree. Yeah.
Katie has one. Would it be feasible to collaborate with car insurance agencies to obtain information?
That is one that I have not actually looked into before. And based off of the studies I understand now, I don't think that is something that they are looking towards. I think privatizing some of these can also be somewhat problematic.
Yeah. I know that I watched too many commercials, and that Progressive supposedly had that thing you plugged into your system to try to determine your driving. Maybe that goes back to the libertarians. Gilberto asks, how is the general equilibrium model mentioned in the abstract?
So I do not actually have any part in the model, so I have limited knowledge into that. But I do, and from what I understand, it is an input-output model, so it's able to understand the financial implications along with carbon implications.
Joaquin had asked if electrical vehicles be taxed at the same per mile basis as internal combustion vehicles. Has there been discussions on that?
Yes, that is one of the main benefits of actually doing vehicle miles traveled programs. The fact that we're going to be able to not just punish people who are still driving gasoline vehicles. And so, yes, electric vehicles would be under this charge. And again, as we move more towards electric vehicles as a society, this is one of the important reasons why we have to look towards vehicle miles traveled programs.
Yeah, I mean, because it changes the whole philosophy from when it was just internal combustion and simply gasoline. Okay. Any other questions from anyone for Brittany?
Yes, I have another question. So
Okay.
this is sort of related. I'm wondering what incentives there are currently, if any, for say carpooling and biking or walking to work.
Based off of my knowledge, I'm actually not sure if there are incentives, but that is what one of our professors is actually looking towards.
So there's somebody that's at least thinking the same question.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we're going to look towards on our survey too, is seeing if there are those kind of incentives as well.
Great, thank you so much.
John Leonards asks again this question: have other states done anything similar? Are we kind of like on the tip of the spear here, or are there a bunch of other states that are doing something similar?
Yeah, there are a lot of states who are actually doing these pilot programs. Off the top of my head, I can think of Oregon is pretty much the leader. They've been looking towards these programs since 2008, I believe. And other states such as California has been very progressive towards these methods, along with Colorado. And I believe in Pennsylvania, they actually signed an executive order that said that they're phasing out gas tax. So, and that's even the highest gas tax rate in the entire nation. So if they're already starting to phase that out, I believe that we're going to see a lot more states start their own pilot programs as well.
They would probably indeed be a bellwether then on that. And then Joaquin had a follow-up. Would this tax, this is what he's calling it, be applied to any type of transportation, such as train?
I don't believe so. I don't exactly know how other transportation sectors go about if there's even any charging. I would imagine so. But this would be strictly public roads. So even private roads that, let's say if you drive a mile to get onto your land, you wouldn't be charged on that land. So I don't believe so.
Well, I'm going to stop the questions because I think you got a lot of them. You've fielded them well. Thank you for that. And please, everyone, remember that we have evaluations to give to all our presenters, and this really does help them understand how they communicated, how they presented, and their concepts in the midst of the research. So please remember that. And Sophie's put some things up here again for that, so that's wonderful. And we're going to the last presentation that we have for today, but one thing I want to state before we go on is that if indeed we have a little extra time after Anthony does his presentation, we will probably have a minute interlude so we can let everybody take a deep breath and then just open it for some questions of all 5 of our presenters, if you wish, and see if a 10 or 15-minute total time might be helpful as we look at their research and their vision of things now and into the future. But let me introduce our 5th and our present student research oral presentation giver, Anthony Morgan, coming from the Petroleum Department, a graduate student. And I'm interested in this just because it's an interesting title, Anthony. So please go ahead and begin.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. So I will be presenting on a gate-to-gate life cycle assessment for the carbon dioxide enhanced oil recovery operations at the Farnsworth unit. That's in Texas. And this unit is, this operation is part of the Southwest Regional Partnership on Carbon Sequestration. And it's not actually my graduate dissertation, but it's an additional research that my advisors came up with that we have to look at and analyze. All right, so I'm Anthony Morgan, and I will take you through a brief introduction to life cycle assessment and the operations or the EOR operations on the Farnsworth unit field. And then we'll look at the estimation of impact factors or emissions, some results and discussions, and summary and conclusion. So basically, we are looking at the analysis through a life cycle greenhouse gas assessment of the carbon dioxide enhanced oil recovery operations of the Farnsworth unit. So life cycle assessment, basically, it's a way by which environmental impacts associated with a product or service or a process is understood, and possible solutions are developed to get these impacts addressed. And the carbon dioxide enhanced oil recovery system is no exception, since it consists of several processes and components that may generate emissions, hence the need for a life cycle assessment. And for a life cycle assessment, based on the International Standard Organization 4044 published in 2006, they gave a framework which basically, initially, you have to define your goal or your scope, which aims at where aims and the limitations of the study are stated. That is what the analysis you want to embark on will show. And the next thing you have to do is, once you have defined your goal and your scope, you have to do an inventory analysis, which is one of the aspects of the assessment, which is quite challenging, because each component of whatever boundary you are looking at or goal you are looking at, whichever operations within these boundaries needs to be assessed, and their various units with their possible impact factors needs to be developed. So the next is the impact assessment. And with the impact assessment here, we look at the characterization of the various emissions and then the classifications of these emissions. So with classification here, we mean classifying the various emissions or emittents into a particular group of impact on the environment. So for example, in our case, where we are looking at global warming, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide are common and major impact to global warming. And hence, we group these emittents under global warming as a classification. And their impact factors are quantified. The impact of an amount of these emittents on the environment is quantified. That is the characterization of these impact factors. And from there, we interpret the results and as to how are we going to address this impact estimated, and how will it be reduced to help improve processes within a particular scope or goal we have defined. So a simple way of estimating your impact factor is the summation of the various characterization factors, the summation of the product, the characterization factors, and their mass emitted, or the mass of the pollutants emitted. And so, for example, here we have global warming. So a summation of the global warming potential measured in kilogram per carbon dioxide equivalent per kilograms of the pollutants times its mass emission. So next, we will look at the Farnsworth unit. I'll introduce you to a brief introduction to the Farnsworth unit operations. And the Farnsworth unit is located in Texas, Austin. And the major CO2 sources of the Farnsworth unit is from Albion fertilizer plant in Boulder, Texas, and then the Alkalon ethanol plant in Liberia, Kansas. So with the Farnsworth unit, anthropogenic carbon dioxide is captured and then transported to the field. So it's transported to the field, and in the field we have the central tank battery, where and then two various WAG injectors, and they produce fluid from the oil waters and then transferred back to the central bank battery, and then reprocessed and injected. So fresh CO2 from the Alkalon ethanol plant or the Bulgar fertilizer plant is transported to the central bank battery and then injected under high pressure into injection wells. And from these injection wells, these injected fluids are then transferred into the reservoir, and the reservoir is what contains the crude oil. So what the CO2 does is the CO2 mixes with the reservoir oil, and once it mixes the reservoir oil, what it does is it reduces the viscosity of the oil. And by reduction in viscosity means enhancing mobility of the oil to flow to production wells. And the amount of CO2 injected, part is produced with the oil, and then part also remains in the reservoir, which is part is stored in the reservoir. That is the major focus of this. So in effect, we are getting two goals here, whereby we store CO2, which in case would have gone into the atmosphere and caused global warming, and at the same time producing oil, which is needed for energy. So the goal and scope of this project is to estimate or identify major contributors to greenhouse emissions of the CO2 EOR operations of the Farnsworth unit. And with this, 100-year global warming potential coefficients were employed to convert nitrous oxide and methane to equivalent CO2. So our estimations will be in equivalent of carbon dioxide. And our unit is in kilograms CO2 equivalent per barrel of crude oil. So our estimations will be based on these units. So the approach used here partly follow the framework by the ISO 4040 and a plain CO2 reduction approach by Department of Energy. And this comes with a model which users can modify to suit specific fields and CO2 EOR operations. So it is a complete cradle to grave life cycle assessment, and it has the upstream, the gate to gate, and the downstream section. But in our case, I'm looking at the Farnsworth units. So my boundary would just emphasize only the Farnsworth units, and that will be a gate to gate life cycle assessment. So this was modified for this work based on two scenarios. And one is the life cycle assessment specific to the Farnsworth and compared to a more generalized CO2 enhanced oil recovery operations. So that is with the Farnsworth unit, no gas separation. And with more generalized operations, we include gas separation, which we believe to be a major source of energy usage per review of literature. And with this, I considered refrigeration, Reinholz, and membrane gas separation techniques. And with scenario 2 also looks at the Farnsworth unit's life cycle assessment for a forecasted CO2 enhanced oil recovery for a period of 18 years. And a base case is looked at, and an optimized case where flexible compressors capacity, conversion of existing water wells to water alternating gas wells, less or no fugitive emissions from systems, no volatile oil component emissions from storage of carbon dioxide, oil, and water, and injection of all produced water, etc., were considered in this optimized scenario. So based on the transport unit operations, this flow chart is developed to represent the boundary within which the life cycle would cover. That is the gate-to-gate life cycle. So in summary, the accounted for units processes are the injection and recovery, bulk separation and storage, that is the gas liquid injection. Supporting processes, example, are the venting and then the flaring. And finally, but not captured in the flow diagram for the transport unit, is the gas separation, which will not be considered as part of the unit of the transport unit. And so the inventory on the various unit processes with regards to the emissions will be collected based on this boundary together with the gas separation techniques. So for the continuing the life cycle inventory, the figure 5 here represents summary of the production and injection data gathered from the transport unit from December 2010 to August 2020, and purchased CO2 amounted to about 1.5 metric tons, with net storage of about 92%, and the corresponding crude production of that was about 4.8 barrels, and about 16 barrels of water was collected from the transport unit. And the summary here also gives the production volumes from our simulation case for the prediction for 18 years. And some assumptions we looked at were CO2 leakage rate over a 100-year period was set to 0%. That is to say that there's not going to be CO2 leakage from our reservoir once the carbon dioxide has been injected into these formations, because it was analyzed that the seal integrity of the reservoir is quite high, and hence over a 100 years period plus, there's not going to be leakage. And also the hydration of produced gas were not required, and treatment of produced water was also omitted for these case scenarios for the transport units. For other CO2 EOR units, the table here also summarizes a selected inventory data collected. So for the gas separation technique, for the three of them, these are some of the energy consumptions and tabulated here, as well as some other operations of the enhanced oil recovery operations has also been tabulated here for your view. Also, these are some of the calculations that were also made. For the simulation case, we needed to account for the amount of brine or produced water, and as well as amount of hydrocarbon gases that is produced along with the crude oil from the reservoir. And this power law by Department of Energy and ETO helps us estimate this amount based on the amount of crude oil produced. So For the estimated emission factors and emissions, that's for the gas processing, it could be seen that for a more generalized CO2 EOR, which has some heavier hydrocarbon gases component, gas separation is required. And so these three gas separation techniques were looked at and assessed. So for gas separation by refrigeration, this process of operation, the gas is fed into a stream and allows the CO2 to be separated from ethane and higher hydrocarbons. So the hydrocarbons are then separated using series of distillation columns, and ethane is in some cases it's recombined with CO2-rich injection for injection. And this process can be reconfigured. For refrigeration, it can be reconfigured to bypass distillation columns, and this could reduce energy consumption. That's one advantage of the refrigeration technique. With Reinholms, it uses three steps: a refrigerated vessel that separates CO2 and light hydrocarbons, and a natural gas liquid. And it also has a de-ethanizer, which recovers methane that can be used as plant fuel, and gas separation columns separate light and heavy hydrocarbons. So one advantage of the Reinholms here is that it separates hydrocarbon into higher purity streams with higher market value. And with membrane also, membrane separates two types of gas based on the differences between their permeation rate through a non-porous semi-permeable membrane. And this comes with a predetermined compression of gas to about 3.5 megapascals. And then is the dehydration and a chilling unit. So based on each of these unit processes, it comes with their energy requirement on the material usage. Hence, the penalty here for Reinholms and membrane is a high energy consumption, which can be seen from the analysis here that the emissions and emission factors for fractionation or refrigeration, Reinholms, and membrane. Refrigeration has quite a low emission factor. That's about 1.5 kilograms CO2 equivalent per barrel, as against 13.6 and 51.5 kilograms CO2 equivalent per barrel of crude oil produced. And figure 7 and figure 8 here illustrates the various components within this unit that contributes to these emissions. And we could see that natural gas upstream has a higher impact or has a higher emission rate as compared to other processes, followed by natural gas combustion and electricity usage. So this can tell which part of this unit needs to be looked at in reducing or enhancing the efficiencies of these equipment. So on scenario 1, we also look at the emission factors based on the Farnsworth unit without including gas separation. So we could also see from the Farnsworth unit that flared or vented produced gases is the highest emitter of greenhouse gases as compared to the rest of the various operations, where CO2 compression and injection electricity comes next, artificial lift, construction, and followed by brown injection as well as brown disposal, electricity or energy usage. So this gives us a fair idea of which aspects of these operations emit more greenhouse gases. So another analysis, a comparative analysis was done for the Farnsworth unit as against operations with gas separation units. And it could also be seen from the figures here, and as well as the table here, as well as the figure here, that Farnsworth units comes as low, takes the lowest, as followed by refrigeration. And looking at the net purchased CO2, that is initially for the Farnsworth unit. For the Farnsworth unit, without life cycle assessment, and 92% of the purchased CO2 was stored. But after life cycle assessment, it came down to 79.28%, which is to tell us that there are significant emissions coming from the operations of the enhanced oil recovery, CO2 enhanced oil recovery processes on the Farnsworth units. So next, we look at the forecasted Farnsworth units carbon dioxide enhanced oil recovery with optimized conditions. So initially, the base case followed the current operational conditions, and then the forecasted case was a case which omitted certain emissions from most of the processes. So with that, the base case had a total emission factor of about 10 kilograms per CO2 per barrel, as against the forecasted case. So the forecasted case was 10, and then the base case was 28.08. That saw quite a reduced emission factor when these conditions spelled out are incorporated in their operation for a period of 18 years. And for this scenario also, looking at the various units within the Farnsworth operations, venting and flaring for both the base case and the optimized case still gave the highest emissions, followed by the compressed artificial lift, and then CO2 compression and construction, and then land use, which are equal. So a comparative analysis was also done for the Farnsworth unit's current operations and its emissions as against other operations, CO2 enhanced oil recovery operations. And it could also be seen that the Farnsworth unit has quite a lower emission factor as compared to other CO2 operations, which is to tell us that the Farnsworth unit has quite a simple schematic for their units or operations. That is, no separation of gases, which is a major contribution to emission of greenhouse gases, is omitted within the Farnsworth unit, and no separation of gases from volatile oil components. So in effect, the separated gases are all re-injected into the formation for one, enhanced oil recovery, and furthermore also for storage. And so this makes the Farnsworth unit quite advantageous over other CO2 enhanced oil recovery operations. So in conclusion, though the Farnsworth unit has quite a simple schematic for their operations, but looking at the net CO2 storage per the amount of fresh CO2 purchased, initially was 22, and after a life cycle assessment was conducted, a 79% was realized, which means that there are significant emissions coming from their various operations, with which, when an optimized case was effected, an 86% storage was seen, which means an improvement in their operations could help limit further the emissions within the operation. And in many instances, these operational unit emissions are not looked at, hence this analysis. And so from the analysis, flared or vented carbon dioxide and other emittents were the highest, and energy consumption comes next, which means that in bid to reduce emissions from their operations, efficiency of the units being used on the transfer units needs to be improved, which in most cases or most instances is quite challenging. But more practical approach is the reduction of the flared or vented gases, which, if the capacity of the systems on the transfer unit is expanded to inject more CO2, could reduce this vented or flared aspect of the emissions drastically. So in acknowledgement, this project was funded by, provided by the US Department of Energy, the National Energy Technology Laboratory, through a Southwest Regional Partnership on Carbon Sequestration under the award number. And thank you, and these are some selected references. And thank you, and questions are welcome.
We have some questions for Anthony on his presentation on the FWAU processing and its significance in the midst of addressing CO2 emissions.
Could you please repeat that for me, please? I'm
asking if they've got questions for me. Does anybody have questions? One of the things I picked up, Anthony, it appears you believe the FWAU process is more efficient and the CO2 issues are less than the other processes that are present. Is, you know, like you'd compared Canadian oil sands and things like that, that the FWAU process is perhaps more ecologically safe, or more of a good, forget lack of a better term, bet than other processes. You want to talk on that just a second more? You figure the FWAU process is a good one?
Okay, so the analysis looked at the transport unit,
right,
and then a generalized enhanced oil recovery, CO2 enhanced oil recovery operations, where with a transport unit, a number of operations are not incorporated, and with a generalized CO2 enhanced oil recovery, there is the incorporation of gas separations, which are key components, energy users, and greenhouse gas emitters. So with a transport unit, it doesn't include these processes. And this is because the amount of gases produced are all separated and re-injected again back into the formation to enhance recovery and partly to be stored. So in effect, more of these gases are not being released to the atmosphere, but are being re-injected for storage.
So it does some good with that whole process of recycling and reinserting that gas.
Exactly.
Okay. Other questions for Anthony? Anybody have one that they'd like to share? While you're thinking of those questions, I want you to note that Katie has put up the evaluation link for this, so Anthony can receive our comments and our understanding of his presentation. for tonight. A lot of information, a lot of analysis, and certainly something that takes a good bit of insight and also some appreciation for the process itself. So thank you, Anthony. I note that we have Anthony, Brittany, Charlotte, Joaquin, and I believe we still have also Casey with us. Are there any general questions or any questions you might want to give to any of our presenters after listening to all 5 of their presentations?
No questions, but everyone did well.
Yeah, wonderful job, everyone.
Absolutely. So
Excellent, excellent, everyone.
yeah.
That's a hard one to judge between them.
Oh yeah, because that's the good thing about these nice oral presentations. They're a little longer. They give us a little more information, and they give us a lot to think about. So I want to congratulate all of you, Casey, Waheen, Charlotte, Brittany, and Anthony, for taking not only the time to do this research, but then put it into comprehensible presentations for us to be able to listen with you and to get some insights on the topics that you have been dealing with. So that's awful, Richard. Richard would just mention that usually when we have these types of presentations in public with the dinner and everything, there's one good dessert table. So, okay. I want to thank everyone for being with us tonight. It's been a good presentation and a nice representation of the research that is done by students here at New Mexico Tech. And we want to thank you for attending this evening session. And once more, I'd like to thank, of course, Dr. Chowdhury and Ms. Ubanoff and all of the student presenters, as well as the SRS staff. We have, of course, placed those links to the evaluation forms. Please fill one out for each of the presenters. They really are important for each of them to be able to understand how they presented and key types of insights you received and maybe further questions that you might have. I'd like you to take a look at the upcoming events for the Student Research Symposium. Tomorrow is the next event of the SRS, which is poster session 3, which will start at 10 a.m. and go to 12. We also happen to have the Computer Science and Engineering Department showcase that you'll see there starting at 1. And the all-exciting 3-minute speech competition starts at 1. And that is kind of a rapid fire, or what I would call one of those elevator speeches that you have to give in 3 minutes and really make a lot of sense. So those are exciting presentations as well, and want you to consider attending any of those types of sessions that we'll have tomorrow on Thursday. Thanks again for being with us. I'm David Cox, and I'm glad that you were able to share with these students their research. Stay safe, of course. We hope to see you tomorrow at poster session 3.